lecture, Gotham in the Second World War, which is part of our series, our Gotham Center Forum series. But before that, I just want to briefly remind you that there's 3 other forums upcoming in the next couple of weeks. The next one is in 2 weeks on October 28th. It's called the Brooklyn Film. And John Manbeck and Robert Singer are going to discuss their new book, The Brooklyn Film, Essays in the History of Filmmaking, and they'll be showing video clips, and a couple of other scholars will be joining them. Sharon Zukin will be giving a book talk and book signing for her new book, Point of Purchase, How Shopping Changed American Culture, which is forthcoming from Rutledge, and that will be on November 10th. And finally, our final event for this semester will be Sweatshop USA, a panel discussion on the forthcoming book, also from Rutledge, Sweatshop USA, the American Sweatshop in Historical and Global Perspective. And as all of you know by now, these events are all free and open to the public, but we do require you to register. Thank you all for doing that. And if you don't register ahead of time, we will have a waiting list, and then if there's room, we'll allow you to come in. For any more information about our events, our upcoming events, you can go to our website, which is www.gothamcenter.org. And now, without further ado, I don't think he needs much introduction, Mike Wallace.
On December 27, 1941, roughly 2 weeks after Hitler had declared war on the United States, Captain Reinhard Hartigan, commander of U-boat 123, cruising somewhere in the North Atlantic, finally shared with his crew the mission instructions he'd received from Admiral Karl Donitz. Their target, New York City. Their orders to attack shipping in, at, and around the harbor. The bemused captain added that the High Command had been unable at the last minute to scrape up marine maps or operational charts, but they had helpfully supplied a guidebook, first guidebook, that someone had picked up at the 1939 World's Fair. It was a series of neutrality acts that blocked loans or shipments to belligerents, hopefully precluding the emergence of interests or incidents that could suck the country into conflict. Each potential casus belli that arrived, whether originated by Italians, Spaniards, Japanese, or Germans, only strengthened the widespread determination to avoid revisiting the slaughter fields of 1914 to 18. America first. But this East-West characterization overlooks the fact that the same debate roiled Gotham itself. While it's true that in the late 1930s the city was home to a growing movement led by New Yorker-in-Chief Franklin Roosevelt to at least expand aid to beleaguered Britain, or increasingly to intervene militarily on its side, the city was simultaneously home to millions of people determined not to actively side with the British, whether or not they sympathized. Vigorous display at Madison Square Garden on the evening of Washington's birthday, February 20th, 1939. 22,000 German-American Bundists roared approval from denunciations of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and idled U.S. flags and a huge portrait of Washington. Fascism is 20th century Americanism. When Herald Tribune reported Dorothy Thompson expelled from Germany in 1934 on personal orders from Hitler, interrupted a paean to racial purity with raucous laughter, Führer Fritz Kuhn's swastika stormtroopers manhandled her out the door. The corpulent Kuhn disavowed by respectable Germans, was soon arrested, but even those with reservations about Hitler's regime didn't want the U.S. to fight for organizations, called for U.S. neutrality, and sponsored anti-war rallies. There were, of course, dissenters, Senator Robert F. Wagner, theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and the outbreak of war after Pearl Harbor brought a turnaround, though attacks on locals as a potential fifth column would persist, as in the house on 92nd Street, in which Loki battles Yorkville Nazis. The New York Irish were vigorous opponents of England and its empire, and their staunch Catholicism helped shape positions on other world events. Many rejoiced in 1939 in the triumph of Franco, defender of the faith. Differences on overseas issues promoted antipathy to local Jews, whom they deemed anti-fascist, pro-communist, and increasingly interventionist. But this hostility had local roots as well. Since the Guardians coming to mayoral power, if not earlier, Gotham's Gales had, they believed, in losing out to Jews, demographic Jews, notably in teaching, and responding to issues advanced by the American Labor Party and the Communists. At the same time, they had come under demographic pressure from newly arrived German Jewish refugees, particularly in their former stronghold of Washington Heights. The Catholic Church, under the command since 1939 of Archbishop Francis Spellman, had bid for revitalizing its cultural authority, winning the firing of Bertrand Russell, censoring popular entertainment, and it now overlooked, or, in the case of the Brooklyn Hierarchy and its diocesan paper, the Brooklyn Tablet, greenlighted their flock support for the increasingly anti-Semitic radio priest, Father Gotham. Some Irish Americans headed further right, joined the Christian Front, allied with the Bund, and began assaulting Jews on the street, boycotting their stores and desecrating their synagogues, while Irish Copts, 400 of whom were Christian fronters, turned a blind eye. FBI arrests in 1940 thwarted a plot to bomb multiple Jewish targets and deflated the movement for a time, but most Irish rallied around Pearl Harbor, but the front would remain active through the war. New York's Italians had been ardent supporters of Mussolini's efforts to recapture the splendors of the Roman Empire and vigorously hailed his invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. With Generoso Pope, local sand magnate and publisher of Il Progresso, as chief cheerleader. Popular opinion on this issue. Italy's invasion of France in 1940 shocked many into rethinking, but far more fury was unleashed against FDR for his hand that held the dagger speech, seen correctly as pandering to anti-Italian stereotypes, and Roosevelt's Italian electoral support fell off a cliff in 1940. Rather than ethnically anti-war, including Catholic worker Doyen Dorothy H.A. Musty and Byron Breslin of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Gandhi administered John Haynes Holmes, socialists under Norman Thomas, as per their World War I internationalism, but trots around partisan review who feared war would militarize the U.S., the War Resisters League, isolationist academics like Charles Beard, Quakers, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the location on the war-peace spectrum. Extending a concern for and identification with African resistance to European colonialism that dated back to efforts by both Garvey and Du Bois, Harleyites defended Ethiopia abroad by sparring with Italians at home, particularly those next door in East Harlem, in street clashes, boycotts of Italian businesses, and by exulting over symbolic victories in the boxing ring, such as Joe Lewis's demolition of Primo Carnera on a sultry June evening matter, they had their own master race to contend with. Still, after Pearl, they closed ranks, as Du Bois had counseled them to do in the First War, though some sympathy for Japanese victories would crop up from time to time on Harlem soapboxes. More definitively, on the anti-Axis side, were the city's Chinese, Jews, U.S. policymakers towards supporting China, as at the 1937 Madison Square Garden rally backed by the Chinese Hand Laundry Alliance. Others pushed a boycott of Japanese products. 2,000 women, mobilized by the American Friends of the Chinese People, organized a march of 2,000 women down Fifth Avenue carrying banners reading, "We'd rather wear cotton stockings than silk ones." Or they picketed cargo ships carrying scrap iron, readily convertible to military hardware, to Japan. Where the Chinese presence was tiny and their influence limited, Jews, the city's largest ethnic group, were 2 million strong, but their influence proved similarly limited. Opposition to the Nazi regime had followed hard upon its installation of the Sundites, but as retail trade constituted but a small percentage of German-American commerce, it had little larger effect. Anti-fascist militancy was fed by the Nuremberg laws of 1935 and the barbarities of Kristallnacht 1938, and Jewish organizations, nearly all headquartered in Gotham, demanded and won sympathy from local and federal officials for the plight of European Jews, but the sympathy remained largely verbal and symbolic. Certainly, there was no action on a crucial issue of relaxing the stringent immigration laws to accommodate Jewish refugees. Indeed, some isolationists, fearing anti-Jewish atrocities might provide a casus belli, further stoked an already growing anti-Semitism, and fear of feeding that backlash led some Jewish organizations to reject public agitation in favor of behind-the-scenes pressure. Organizations that had large Jewish memberships but were not ethnically organized were far less inhibited. The communists, headquartered off Union Square, were among the most militantly anti-fascist and pro-interventionist organizations, at least until they wheeled on their heels after the 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact, putting them in the anti-war camp for 2 critical years until Hitler's drive to the east produced another volte-face in 1941. New York's Jewish garment workers, notably Sidney Hillman's ILGWU and David Dubinsky's Amalgamated, remained consistent supporters of each presidential move toward the ability to attack the United States itself. Some in Gotham's business leadership also saw a silver lining to world war, in that supplying combatants and rearming our own military might finally end the Depression, even generate an economic boom. On the day Germany invaded Poland, the New York Stock Exchange had its best session in 2 years, and the bond market leapt up in the heaviest day of trading in U.S. history. The House were changed by a change of course by the Federal Council of Churches. Particularly influential in strengthening the drift toward war was the Council of Foreign Relations. Since the 1920s, a place where the New York corporate elite clustered with experts and hammered out a broad-based consensus on foreign affairs. In 1939, it established a War and Peace Studies Initiative, funded largely by the Rockefeller Foundation, to both analyze the unfolding situation and to serve as an informal, indeed secret, planning agency for Roosevelt's State Department. Many of its members joined groups devoted to public advocacy, first the Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies, and then, after the fall of France, the ad hoc Century Group, after its meeting place at the Century Association, which thought up the destroyer of the bases deal and worked closely with Roosevelt to make it happen. By the winter of 1940-41, elite New York warhawks had set up a Fight for Freedom committee to battle America firsters and press for a declaration of war. The New York media was especially prominent in the push toward aid and intervention. The Herald Tribune, Dorothy Thompson, indicted Nazi misanthropy and American apathy, and her fellow columnist Walter Lippmann promoted an expansive vision of U.S. power in the world's decisive impact. At first, the New York business elite's relationship with Washington was complicated by the preceding decade of adversarial relations with Roosevelt and his New Dealers. Most of Gotham's corporate and financial elite had felt sidelined, and most were Republicans, though increasingly disaffected from their heartland isolationist pro-tariff counterparts who were rooted in manufacturing in the Midwest rather than commerce and finance in the port city of New York. Under the press of grim European events, Wall Streeters found themselves drawn. It had been about domestic affairs. I and my colleagues are heart and soul with you for unlimited material aid to Britain and for national defense. FDR, in turn, was cautiously drawn to them, increasingly convinced he needed a rapprochement he was going to launch and run a war. While still New Dealer enough to prefer not handing the economy back over to corporations that had proved all too myopic about the public interest, he was realist enough to appreciate the fact that they owned the nation's industrial plant and could probably thwart any mobilization from which they did not benefit. It was also true that while he had, in his way, fought hard for the New Deal initiatives, the New Deal had become a dead letter since 1938, stymied by conservative opposition from Midwestern Republicans and Southern Democrats. Key New Dealers, moreover, including Eleanor Roosevelt, Harry Hopkins, LaGuardia, and Henry Wallace, had begun to think that a defense buildup imperative a virtual coup and seized control of their party from the isolationists. Snatching the nomination from Taft, Vandenberg, and New York's Tom Dewey, the latter one of their own, but at this point deemed too cozy with the Midwesterners to be trusted, and handed it over to a total political neophyte, one Wendell Willkie. A New Yorker since 1929, Wilkie, a power company executive, had spent most of the 1930s fighting the TVA in tight alliance with the Morgan interests. Percent in Gallup surveys of possible nominees, the New Yorkers went briskly to work. The Cravat Law Firm became his unofficial finance committee. Media baron Luce wrote his major address, which Time and Life puffed, and dispatched the editor of Fortune to run the campaign. The Reed brothers plumped for Wilkie in their Herald Tribune, as did their prize pundits Lippman and Thompson. Madison Avenuers constructed a rustic image for him as a good old boy from Indiana. Just a simple barefoot boy from Wall Street, Iggy's cracked. Warren Root, the 29-year-old nephew of Elihu Root, co-founder with Teddy Roosevelt, announced the selection of Henry Stimson, preeminent leader of the New York establishment, to be Secretary of War. And that was just the beginning. In short order, a host of bankers and lawyers were summoned down to D.C. John J. McCloy, Robert Lovett, Robert Patterson, James Forrestal, Averill Harriman, Wild Bill Donovan, Ferdinand Everstott, Nelson Rockefeller, most of them well known to one another for interlocking business arrangements and the city's social scene, policy organizations, and prep schools. They in turn proved just the advance guard for a vast armada of dollar-a-year men on loan from the wider corporate world, though an amazing number of key posts went to Gothamites, particularly members of the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR member employed said, who served among other things as Stimson's personnel chief, and he later recalled, quote, "Whenever we needed a man, we thumbed through the roll of council members and put through a call to New York." In empowering this platoon of Wall Streeters, moreover, Roosevelt was disempowering an earlier platoon, the very different set of New Yorkers drawing our global agenda. Roosevelt would trounce Wilkie in the Subway Series election come November. But over the crucial summer and fall of 1940, his candidacy knew to mobilization initiatives like passage of a selective service law that in short order led to the registration of 16 million men for the draft. Soon, Congress was appropriating that jettisoning neutrality might provoke civil war, starting in the city on the Hudson. Predictions which LaGuardia, with GNP shooting from $69 billion in 1939 up to $92 billion in 1941, largely directed by New Yorkers. The immediate consequences for the city. Back in the 30s, the New Dealers had generously funneled public works dollars to the South and West, partly in a high-minded effort to develop previously disadvantaged. After news of Pearl Harbor arrived, 200 Japanese considered dangerous were rounded up by the FBI and police and placed in detention on Ellis Island. LaGuardia issued orders throwing security guards around bridges, tunnels, and factories, and told WNYC listeners they should have no false sense of security by virtue of being on the East Coast, arguing that, quote, Nazi thugs and gangsters were the masterminds behind the bombing of Pearl. 2 days later, jittery observers believing enemy bombers had been sighted triggered an air raid alert. In the absence of proper sirens, the task was assigned to police cars and fire engines. Fighters were scrambled, but it proved a false alarm, as did another purported sighting the next morning. The real menace, as we have seen, arrived by sea. The day after Germany declared war on the U.S., December 11, 1941, Admiral Rader and Hitler decided to send 6 of Douglas's top U-boat aces to assault coastal shipping, launching Operation Bogenschlag, Gunfeet, or Thunder. They turned his U-boat away, and several were blowing up a tanker just off the Hamptons, thus beginning what the Germans called the American turkey shoot. Within 2 weeks, he and his colleagues sank 35 ships between Newfoundland and Bermuda, with the oil tankers lumbering up from Gulf Coast ports, particular prizes. To minimize this traffic, oil deliveries were strictly shifted to railroad tank cars, and the government launched the most colossal engineering feat of the war, construction of the big-inch pipeline that would eventually run 1,250 miles from the Texas oil fields to the New York harbor. But in February 42, Eisenhower told George Marshall that the unsecured sea lanes could torpedo the entire war effort, and that same month FDR warned that the enemy might, quote, come in and shell New York tomorrow night. Jumpy about spies and worried that fifth columnists among New York's Italian-American fishing fleet and longshoremen might be aiding U-boats with intelligence and fuel, the 3rd Naval District's Office of Naval Intelligence took its first steps toward establishing a relationship with the city's mafia and the mob-controlled international. Not that the U-boats needed spies, given the refusal of New York and other coastal communities to dim their waterfront lights, lest it cramp the tourist trade. And the seaboard remained a neon-lit shooting gallery until April 42, when the eastern sea frontier finally ordered a brownout, banning the outdoor advertising signs, known as spectacles, and draining Times Square of its incandescence. In partial compensation, Spectacle Meister Douglas Lay quickly erected an unilluminated camel sign that featured, in alternation, soldiers, sailors, and Marines puffing perfect smoke rings, actually steam rings, every 20 seconds. In June, some actual, it astonished as a precedent, and sentenced to death by electrocution. For all anxiety, however, there were no mass roundups or internments of European enemy aliens, partly because during a demonstration called New York at War, floats depicted an Axis war monster as one enemy, but depicted the Japanese literally as yellow in the 1940 election. And the ever-pragmatic FDR dramatically lifted their designation as enemy aliens on Columbus Day, 1942. But by that time, the noose around the city's neck had loosened considerably. The day was over, and the coast was clear for New York City to become the most spectacular warport in the world. Now, let me pause here for a moment to explain what I'm up to tonight. What I'm offering is a preposterously abbreviated version of what will eventually constitute 4 chapters in Volume 2 of Gotham, covering the 4 years. The material here is perhaps 1/8 the length of what it will be. The March on Washington that's shot by in 2 sentences will occupy 2 pages. It is also, I must plead, a very preliminary state, and considerable research and fact-checking lies ahead. And civilian staff. But what made their task doable were New York's peerless pre-existing facilities and unparalleled abundance. The pilots who boarded battle-damaged boats and troop or munition ships and guided them through hazardous currents past the harbor's hidden reefs, shoals, and bars. The tugboat crews who not only hauled steel barges about the harbor, but took them across the Atlantic to join the Normandy invasion, ferrying weapons and supplies to artificial harbors off Utah and Omaha Beach. The thousands of ILA longshoremen, as reorganized by the Navy, which temporarily scrapped the detested shape-up as inefficient and chaotic, repairing over 5,000 wounded vessels. Federal funds poured in as well to traditional suppliers of military equipment, like Brooklyn's Sperry gyroscope. But overall, defense contracts remained scarce all through 42, as military chieftains and dollar-a-year corporate execs continued to favor their own giant. 3 to the NBC Blue Network sitcom Life of Riley, which focused on an amiable Brooklynite, played by William Bendix, who had moved to California to work as a riveter in the Stevenson aircraft factory. But many jobs decamped only as far as suburbs in nearby Connecticut, New Jersey, and Long Island, triggering a migration that would have potent long-term consequences for the 5 boroughs. Thus, defense plant corporations and Navy contracts enabled Sperry to start up operations in Nassau's Lake success, and allowed Roosevelt. It wasn't simply the result of Roosevelt rewarding his state mates, but rather a belated realization, prodded by the smaller War Plants Division of the War Production Board, that New York's manufacturing system was not inferior to the giant mass production factories in the West, Midwest, and South, just different. Gotham had long been an industrial incubator, its matrix of small concerns linked to a dense concentration of engineers, skilled workers, and machine shops, was capable of responding rapidly to changes in design, technology, and market demand. New York's were quickly converted to turning out war material. In the ensuing explosion of productivity, some companies entered primary war industries like aviation. The Brewster Aeronautical Corporation descended of the old carriage-making company, converted from producing receivers to turning out electronic equipment. Jewelry makers made jewel bearings for instruments. Food packers did cake rations. Pfizer and Company produced well over 50% of the nation, and microfilm maker prepared V letters for overseas troops. The publishing industry's Council on Books sold 100 million copies of cheap paperbacks to the government at cost for free distribution to servicemen, admittedly paving the way for post-war acceptance of the format, introduced in 1939 by the Pocketbook Company. Comic books, another recently developed New York industry, now added servicemen to their kiddie market, shipping millions of Superman. Some more research was done in independent corporate labs like RCA's or Dell's, or in university-based operations underwritten by corporation departments at universities, usually the biggest ones, as when OSRD sponsored work at NYU's mathematics department, directed by refugee Richard Courant, who arrived in 1934 from the University of Gotham. Courant was one of just hundreds of emigres who led Hitler's racial policies, and New York's scientific and academic community, like its artistic and cultural ones, was beneficiary of one of the greatest transfers of intellectual capital in history. The Frankfurt School, and after the fall of France, the Emergency Rescue Committee, put together by intellectuals, emigres, Quakers, leftists, and humanists with aid from Eleanor Roosevelt, dispatched Marion Fry to Marseille with a list of intellectuals and artists in hand. Stonewalled by the ever unhelpful U.S. authorities, the New Yorkers, Wallace and Mead, but his revolutionary development of structural anthropology was fueled by his wartime interactions here with Roman Jacobson, the world's preeminent linguist, and surrealist capo André Breton. Unquestionably, however, the most galvanic chain of encounters, which had immense consequences for prosecution of the war and the future of the planet, began in November 1938 when Enrico Fermi took the all-war money from his Nobel Prize in Physics and emigrated directly from Stockholm to New York City, sheltering his Jewish wife from Mussolini's clutches. Fermi, Roosevelt had to borrow the remaining 56%, but even there the government preferred to float war bonds directly to the public, pitched by the likes of Kate Smith and Babe Ruth, brought out of retirement, at rallies and on radio. 7 drives, each roughly a month long, brought in $135 billion. In truth, the process was less democratic than intended, as despite the ballyhoo, the quota for individuals was seldom filled, leaving banks, insurance companies, and corporations to take up the slack. The rest was borrowed directly from commercial banks, whose holding of treasuries rose from under $1 billion in 41 to over $24 billion in 40. New York's advertising industry, on the other hand, had a great war, though at first it feared the worst. In the late 30s, Madison Avenue was in the New Deal doghouse and under assault from a new generation of consumer activists who decried its hucksterism and denied its necessity. Now, with the government banning production for the duration of almost 90% of pre-war consumer goods and determined to damp down consumer spending in general to ward off inflation, an enterprise geared to stimulating consumption seemed actually counterproductive. Their case wasn't helped by an efflorescence of tasteless profiteering. GE boasted of a light bulb that survived the sinking of the Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor, while a New York cemetery firm sponsored a news program which, after getting off casualty figures, segued directly to, you never know when to expect bad news, so be prepared, buy a lot. Spurred by GI outrage and the tawdriness, which even most admins found foolish, consumerists were urging the olive branch, inviting it to work with the government agencies. They neglected the chance, set up the War Advertising Council, dominated by the big Madison Avenue agencies, and joined with the OWI in hawking bonds and placing public service announcements. But the volunteer copywriters were trained to sell products, not principles, and they tended to promote the war the way they did cornflakes. More broadly, they cast the entire enterprise as a defense of the American way of life, by which they chiefly meant the right to purchase commodities. For what this war is all about, blared one print commercial, is the right to, quote, once more walk into any store in the land and buy anything you want. Disgusted OWI writers and artists protested against this, at one point producing a mock poster displaying a Coca-Cola bottle wrapped in an American flag above the legend, "Step right up and get your four delicious freedoms. It's a refreshing war." But as men were increasingly appointed to the OWI itself, the writers and artists departed or were ousted, and eventually the OWI's domestic branch was completely defunded by Southern congressmen furious at its publication of anti-racist literature. Deemed rehabilitated by its public-spirited contributions to the war effort, the ad industry and its corporate clients were granted a great boon. Even firms with no products to sell were allowed to deduct the cost above those of 1940. Fifth inning stretch. Time to get wagons, if you are so inclined to have previous encounters. Almost certainly their first choice would have been Times Square, as even in its new dimmed-out incarnation, there were always vast numbers of men in uniform, some women too, and mixed with the unprecedented throngs. Why would they have come to Times Square? Well, one of the likeliest possibilities was a desire to get laid, which was mighty easy to do in a hot town at a hot time. As playwright Arthur Lorenz recalled, New York in wartime was the sexiest city in the world. Prostitutes worked the square and its nearby brothels and hotels, and of course many other parts of town where crowds of soldiers or male war workers congregated. Like, if you got money, they don't let you spend it. And something of the same sort applied to sex as well. In a startling development, young women, often in their teens, flocked to Times Square, to bus and train stations, to anywhere they could hook up with military personnel, known variously as catchy wackies, cuddle bunnies, charity girls, chippies, or victory girls. They were seeking not cash, but companionship. Driven, some speculated, by the wartime shortage of men. They're either too young or too old, went one popular song. They aggressively sought out soldiers for either short-term pleasure or perhaps a whirlwind romance to be capped by marriage and often divorce. Rates of both shot up from 1940, as did the birth and BD rates. So while police or MPs camped out in hotel lobbies to forestall commercial encounters, the lawns of Central Park were strewn with girls in summer dresses making out with sailors and soldiers, or copulating behind the tennis courts. And dim-outs and blackouts made the parks especially amorous venues after dark. Times Square was also a great place for boys to meet boys, both prostitutes and local guys out for a good time. There was a wide range of well-known places, from Second Street movie theaters to the more discreet precincts of the Astor Hotel at 7th Avenue and 45th Street, whose oval bar, known nationally since the 1910s as a gay rendezvous, was at its zenith during World War II. There, hundreds of men packed in 6 deep on the gay side, where management welcomed them so long as their self-presentation was understated enough so that the straights on the other side would remain unaware of their presence. The cigarette girls knew the score, however, and liked to circulate through the gay side, crying, "Cigars, cigarettes, hairpins." Finally, there were the streets themselves. Tennessee beamed to the villages from whence they came. For less immediately carnal urges, our trio of sailors could have gone dancing in any of 50-odd nearby nightclubs, piling up to napkin-sized dance floors in venues ranging from low-end honky-tonks to the posh Stork Club, which in 1943 was averaging 2,000 guests per weeknight, 3,000 on the weekends, with Winchell still the presiding deity. Our guys, Frank, Gene, and Jules, would likely be swinging to the music of Jimmy Dorsey or Harry James. But in fact, the big bands were in trouble. From one side, they faced competition from followers of the Latin American music craze, the biggest dance hit. And now, Frank Sinatra. The stage was hit by a deafening tsunami of sound from the shrieking audience of Bobby Soxers. "What the fuck was that?" he asked. That, it would soon be apparent, was yet another nail in the big band coffin. Sinatra stayed on solo for 8 more weeks at the Paramount to ever larger and more hysterical crowds. In short order, he was signed by George Washington Hill, American Tobacco Company president and sponsor of the coast-to-coast radio show, The Lucky, as authentically American as Oklahoma, albeit set in an urban, not rural terrain, and it's in its own way as innovative as Williamsburg, representing an astonishing mixture of individuals and influences. Its progenitor was fancy-free, the ballet choreographed and danced by Jerome Robbins. Himself a product of the city's eclectic cultural scene, Robbins was inheritor of the classic tradition, St. Petersburg's Imperial Ballet and Diagelo's Ballet Russe by way of Fokine and Balanchine, the latter coached here by Lincoln Kirsten in 1933, of modern dance by way of Martha Graham and left-wing choreographers like Anna Sokolov from the Settlement House movement. Robbins would join the CP in 1943. And Broadway Wilfredom, Robbins having joined the chorus of several musical comedies and worked with the likes of Jimmy Durante and Ethel Merman. In 1943, he set up his earliest forays into the city. He settled in for good in 1942. Bernstein befriended uptown composers like Aaron Copland and downtown cabaretters like Adolph Green and his asthma. He was renting an apartment in Carnegie Hall when Robbins knocked on his door that fall and immediately set to scoring the work, drawing again on music popular in the wartime clubs, recording each number as he wrote it with poets displayed in each of the city's 6,700 cars. Spectacular reviews led to its transition to the screen, the film version starring, of course, 3 guys named Frank, Gene, and Jules. Okay, see the fact, given that I've wildly miscalculated my timing, I think when this next chapter, I talk about the impact of the war on gender and family structure. I talk about, quote, leaving, he said, only the tower unprotected to avoid the expense of added cellar debt. But on August 14th, at 7:03 p.m., all of this was set aside as the re-illuminated motogram rippling around the New York Times building confirmed to the 750,000 waiting below what had been rumored now for 5 days. Official, Truman announces Japanese surrender, an announcement to which the Times itself reported, quote, the metropolis exploded. There were 2 million in Times Square, whistling, shouting, screaming, dancing, kissing, snake dancing, playing leapfrog, forming conga chains beneath the thousands of tons of paper confetti cascading down, while fire engines clanged and police sirens wailed as this talk. If any of you have an ounce of stamina left, we actually have.
Originally there was no internments here, right? I was under the impression that there were internments of Italian Americans, primarily in Ellis Island.
A handful. I mean, the critical fact is we got to compare it to what happened to the Japanese. And that was not on the agenda. Yes, there were some, but they were minuscule. I mean, Roosevelt not only came to terms with him generally, but somebody like Pope, who in fact he'd been sicking the FBI out all this time, now in fact he invites to be a counselor for the administration. He was pragmatism itself, and the electoral concerns of the upcoming 44 campaign triumphed over anxieties.
You started off with U-boats. U-boats.
Yes.
It seems to me that I recall that at least one U-boat was captured by American forces off Long Island, and that it ultimately ended up in the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. Is that correct?
Well, it beats me. You know, I sort of am, alas, a synthesizer, which means I get to know a little bit about a lot of things, but not terribly much about anything in particular. And that one I haven't heard of.
Is based on your study priorities of Gotham for the future of Gotham?
Well, that one I think I should beg off on. It would take us too far afield. And in fact, I have nabbed on about that in print in a little book, which is probably sitting outside the door, called, what's it called? A New Deal for New York, which in fact is just loaded with notions about where the city might and should go from here. So I should refer you to that so we can stick to the 1940s. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you the 1944 Democratic Convention from Chicago. Who was the keynote speaker?
The 1944 convention. I don't know. Tell me.
Governor Kerr from Oklahoma.
Okay.
Because it was a very rousing speech he gave. I thought I wanted to know if you knew him.
Well, I thank you for sharing that with us. Sir.
This is a very detailed thing that you've told us today. How long did it take you to accumulate this information and to write it?
You don't really want to know the answer. This is part of a lunatic enterprise that has been going on for many more years than I care to think about. This particular stint, I don't know, I guess 6 months in its last phase, but it's hard to make those determinations because, when I started writing this stuff up, I began opening up files of notes and ideas and so forth, some of which, horrifyingly, were last opened in 1989. And so, this both is a matter of stuff drawn from immediate research, but it's also resting on, figuring out what all this fits into what happened before, what happened afterward. That's been going on for a quarter of a century.
Do you have a staff of researchers, or do you do all this?
Oh, would that I did, but no, I'm afraid this is all me. I do have occasionally some college students who file things and get Xeroxes. But you see, the problem is, this is a very stupid way to work, really, and I'm smarter how to do it differently. But it doesn't do me much good to have researchers, because what I've got to do is to get this vast array of information, given that I'm trying to tackle, race, sexuality, architecture, banking, sewer systems, blah, blah, blah. I have to get it in here and then wait to see what kind of connections pop up. Because nothing that I do is in fact original. The Gotham and Gotham 2 are in essence, acts of grand larceny. They are relying upon appropriating the work of literally thousands of scholars. The only thing I can possibly add to the real labor that they perform is to be able to juxtapose things, to make connections between things, to set them in temporal and other kinds of matrices. And hopefully to put them into English that's accessible. Unlike most scholars who, for a variety of perfectly good reasons, tend to write more for specialized audiences than for real people.
Do you feel sometimes you're overwhelmed by the volume of material that you could utilize and you have to make certain?
Well, yes, like today, but I really did think I could squeeze in that little synoptic business. And I did practice, but I don't know, I must have slowed down. Yeah, I was a little overwhelmed just in terms of the presentation. But honestly, no. The trick to this is if you just assume that there's no rush. The only real deadline that I've got is death. There's the story about Nicholas Malone, who was writing a multi-volume biography of Thomas Jefferson. And he'd gotten up, he got 5 volumes, and he'd gotten up near the end of Jefferson's life. And he himself was getting on in age, and the profession was taking bets as to who would get first to the finish line, Malone or Jefferson. Malone lucked out and made it over the line just in time, and then promptly left the planet. I'm hoping to do something better than that and to get this out in reasonable amount of time. Yes, sir.
One of the most
interesting things you alluded to was Roosevelt's turn to Stimson and the Wall Street people and sort of the New York money in 1940. It's my understanding that Roosevelt's cabinets in his first 2 terms were really very nominally given, in American political history. And you don't, in what you read us, it's not clear what you think the motivation for this term was. Was it isolationism and the coming of the war? Was it Roosevelt's concern about his re-election in 1940? What do you think is the prime motivator?
No, I don't think it was a matter of the election. And, he didn't arrange for these guys to come up with the Wilkie coup. No, he was meeting the mind on grand global strategic issues. I mean, Roosevelt was way out in front of most people, depending on what you think about this whole procedure. He was, from at least 35 on, convinced that the U.S. there's going to be a global conflict the U.S. was going to have to be involved in. And he also had a vision of what, in fact, the post-war order should look like, remarkably early on. And he just worked steadily and consistently pushing. When he looked around at the various array of political forces at that time, the people who were in fact tracking along with him most powerfully were the people of Wall Street, because they had in fact a similar vision of what was coming and where in fact it should go. Furthermore, he was a realist, pragmatist, and he understood what Stimson, in fact, made boldly clear. There's a quote which I didn't use here, but Stimson said, if in fact you want to run a war in a capitalist society, you have to let businessmen make money out of it. I mean, he couldn't have been clearer. And he understood that. And so he came to terms. Given the fact that the New Deal, his coalition, which had carried him along so far, was completely stymied on the national front, this looked to him to be, the only conceivable avenue that he had.
Our president is following that tradition in Iraq.
Well, you said it. Yes, sir.
How did food rationing affect restaurants, and were taxes exempt from gas rationing?
I don't know about taxes. I don't think so. In terms of gas rationing, what they did was they had 3 categories, A, B, and C. When I believe it was A was you could get as much gas in as you wanted, but that was only for doctors, for government officials, very very restricted, and so on down the line. Taxes, I don't believe, were in that category. They might well have been in the B category, which would have restricted the amount, but given them more than what most people were entitled to. I'm sorry, what was your first question again?
Restaurants. How were restaurants affected by food?
Oh, restaurant. The only work that's been done on this has been done in Chicago. There hasn't been an analogous study here. This is very annoying when you're doing a synthesis and somebody hasn't done the work that you need and you don't have time to go out and do it yourself. So I don't really know the answer. In Chicago, it seems pretty clear that given the tremendous difficulty of getting many critical supplies, waiting online for butter and eggs and so forth, given that most of your recipes were shot to hell, in fact, restaurant going increased dramatically. In general, an awful lot of the social life that exploded in New York City were people just getting out of the house. Also didn't have time. Many more, although not as many as often thought, many more women were actually working, were outside the home, and didn't have time for meal production. So I think probably in New York the same thing was true, that it generated an increased attendance at the restaurants.
When you made reference to the house on 92nd Street,
I'm sorry,
when you made reference to the house on 92nd Street, did you say Bogey fought the Nazis up in Yorkville?
Yeah, Bogart.
I think it was Lloyd Nolan.
It was
I think you should
Bogart.
Lloyd Nolan was the...
There's a movie where he fights Conrad Fife, but it's not that one.
It's not that one. Oh, which one is it?
Through the Night. What?
Oh, Through the Night, great, thank you. See? Thank God. I did a trial of the movie here. I told you to need fact checking.
Professor Wallace, you made a passing reference to the inability of the Jewish community to draw attention to the Holocaust. And last night I was reading Arthur Gelb's new book, The City Room, which very cogently, as a number of other books have done, points out the New York Times' lassitude, for lack of a better word, on playing up the Holocaust. fact that the Times, even as the revelations about Buchenwald were coming to light, played it down, played it inside the paper, etc. In your opinion, would a reverse posture by the Times, i.e. playing up the Holocaust, so to speak, have made a difference?
No, is the short answer. The longer answer is, you know, it's funny because I use the Times a lot, which is now happily and easily available online. And I mean, I know the general position on that, and yeah, it's true, but they had an awful lot of coverage. And in fact, you know, for all the differences between, you know, the German Jews, the American Jewish Committee, and the East Europeans in the American Jewish Congress, with the old lines really of cleavage amongst New York City Jews, with the Germans being much more concerned that given this tremendous resurgence of anti-Semitism, and given that people out in the isolationists were worried that in fact, you know, the Jewish atrocity stories might serve as the casus belli that they were trying to avoid, they thought we better not feed these concerns, we better keep a low profile. But the fact is that there were massive rallies, one after another, Madison Square Garden, with a garden filled with tens of thousands of people in the street outside, and these were covered, not only in the Jewish press. It's true that, you know, certainly outside of New York, and, you know, and much of the radio, although Edward R. Murrow, you know, said as early as December 42 that 1 million people have been murdered in Germany. The information was out there. But I hate what-if issues because, you know, who knows, what happens, but it's conceivable to me, from what I know at the moment, that the only way that things could have been, is not the Times, you know, moved to the front page. That would have cut in the ice. The Times didn't have the kind of position and clout that it does have now. The only thing would have been if, in fact, the Jewish community in New York City had gone outside of New York City. In fact, it made a hell of a lot of noise here, but it didn't, in fact, go and do what April Randolph did. And who knows? I mean, Randolph simply threatened 100,000 people descending on Washington, and it hadn't even started yet, would embarrass the hell out of the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt, at this point, cared only for the pragmatics of power. And unless Jews who, in fact, you know, they did public opinion polls that as late as 43, 44 found overwhelmingly Americans did not believe the atrocity stories. They thought they were the latest round of British propaganda, like the Belgian babies. And even in 45, after the camps had been exposed and photographed, an astonishing aggregate, 28% of the population didn't believe it had happened. I mean, the degree of anti-Semitism in the United States and the, more important, the refusal in general to touch the whole rigid structure of the immigration laws is unbelievable. The one exception, and it's an interesting comparison, is with the Chinese. The Chinese, in fact, have no power whatsoever in New York City or anywhere else. But in the global state of affairs, it was horrifically embarrassing that the Japanese could and did drop leaflets all over Asia announcing, the U.S., look at them, they're going on about their Chinese brethren, poor believers. So they weren't allowing Chinese into the United States. And in 1943, only admittedly after some admirals and generals testified that this would be a good idea, the United States repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, to be sure, it left the immigration laws intact, which limited Chinese immigration to 105 in any particular year. But it was a symbolic shift of significant, you know, import. And I was going to say nothing like that was done in terms of policy until 44, when Morgenthau's people came up with that report on the, you know, the complicity of this government in the murder of you know, millions of Jews. And Morgenthau went to Roosevelt and said, "This is it, mission cut pay time," and he established the War Refugee Board.
I have the impression that Rabbi Stephen Wise was who had FDR's ear, was very often, if not continuously, frustrated by the fact that he couldn't get to first base with FDR on immigration policy and on the U.S. posture towards the Holocaust in general.
The bottom line on an awful lot of this is the Solid South. When push comes to shove, he gave them, I mean, he gave them
they had the ability to, in fact, stymie him on all kinds of things. That plus the State Department, plus, Stimson. These guys they're liberals, yes, in some sense, but they've got the same kind of genteel anti-Semitism that, in fact, their class had held on to for ages. They wouldn't allow Jews at that point in the big Wall Street corporate law firms. McCloy, the guy who's the point man on this, even after the Refugee Board is set up, it's McCloy who's given the charge of making it operational. These guys, partly, admittedly, because they hung out with very particular kinds of Jews, like Walt Whitman, who, remember, announced that the real cause of anti-Semitism is the outrageously intolerant behavior of Jews in the big urban centers. Maybe, in fact, the people he hung out with had been somewhat more militant. Who knows? But there are no what-ifs. One more. Failing that, as soon